As we continue celebrating Africa Day, the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs hosted the 11th Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture under the theme Retrospecting to Prospect called Vadis Africa. The lecture was delivered by Vice President and Vice Principal at King's College in London, Professor Funmi Olonisakin. She joins us to talk about the lecture. Professor, a very good evening. Thank you for speaking to us on this Africa Day. Maybe we could start off with the meaning of Africa Day for you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. The Africa Day represents something significant, not just in terms of the history of our continent. It's when we are able to revisit again some of the commitments we made to each other about the pursuit of fundamental freedoms which were fought for very dearly by our predecessors, but also that we can take stock to see what kind of progress we're making towards the commitments that we made to each other. And also to really envision a better future in terms of the destiny of Africa. That is how. That's what Africa Day means to me. It's when we remember those who fought for our liberation, our independence. It's when we take a look at the commitments we made, and when we get to, do some forward look, as it were.
Now, yours was the 11th Thabo Mbeki Africa Day lecture, and you were the keynote addressee. One of the things that you speak of is that around African leaders and their responsibility in sustaining peace on the continent. Would you care to take us through the responsibility of African leaders and where they're coming short?
Indeed, the collective responsibility is one of the things I try to touch on in that lecture, because you can look at African leaders in the individual context, national context, and there will be mixed record, and depending on what the priorities of the people of those contexts, that will be different. When we talk about peace and security as well as regional integration, though, there is a continental commitment that has been made on all fronts, starting with the Organization of African Unity, that also gave way to the African Union and the regional economic communities that are the building blocks for the African peace and security architecture. That collective commitment of leaders to prevent conflict, to manage conflict, and prevent conflict being the basis for larger crises in Africa, that has been found wanting, I argue very strongly. It's been found wanting in recent years, and that's due to a combination of factors, really. Of course, some of those factors are the individual commitments of African leaders and the extent to which they manage to build, sustaining relationships with African citizens, starting from their own countries. But that commitment has to be seen in the kinds of statements that are made, in the kinds of resolve to the conflicts that are going on around us. I focus on two key things around elections and the fact that we continue to have leaders who pursue unconstitutional change in government or extension of their terms in office. But even more fundamentally, you have really armed conflict in several places raging, starting with Tigray. Of course, there's crisis in Mozambique. We see Chad, manifesting its own recent crisis in different ways. Mali, which is in the news today. There's a lot of reason to believe that African leaders have not yet made that kind of commitment to resolving, to at least managing African conflicts in particular ways.
Now, there aren't many instances where the African Union leadership or leaders on the African continent call each other out.
This is a big issue. I have to say, I must say, this is a big issue. But I also think it's difficult to call each other out if actually the vast majority, I'm sure there are a few exceptions, if the vast majority don't have interest in that. And actually, I must say, though, that there's evidence that leaders pursue their own alliances with external partners as well, and privilege those things over the continental peace architecture and over the need to prevent or manage conflicts in other areas. So the result is really checkered. It's checkered. There are things the African Union Commission could do better at, could be better at, and there are things that collectively African heads of state and government could collaborate better. And calling each other out is what actually the vast majority of them could do when they see their counterparts really going astray or at least plunging the different nations into major conflict, particularly those conflicts that have that are accompanied by humanitarian tragedies, as we see in Tigray at the moment.
Now, one of the things you speak about is you say there is a flickering hope from ordinary Africans rising up for the sake of their fundamental freedoms. I'm not quite sure I'm convinced about a flickering hope, or maybe there is, but certainly about rising up for the aspirations and freedom. With the amount of oppression, repression and suppression of individuals' rights, certainly in many African countries.
Absolutely. So one would expect that in 2021 we shouldn't have to see people's movement in the ways that we have seen in these last few years. But it seems to me that ordinary people find themselves having to do this in spite of their leaders. And that actually is the real story. If you compare where we are now to where we were about 20 years ago, where ordinary people were co-opted easily, particularly children, to join armed groups. And to just really, you saw child soldiering, you saw child soldiers in West Africa, actually across the continent, but also in other parts of the world, of course. And for a long time, we said we had 300,000 child soldiers fighting in different wars on the continent. We still do have, pockets of violence that citizens have subscribed to. But in the main, you don't have young people, average age of 19 and a half years, really. The majority are not scrambling to join armed groups. They're actually really fighting for their rights in different ways. They're pursuing livelihoods. They're doing so many interesting things on the margins of the state. And when push comes to shove, they take to their feet. They're on the streets protesting. And so that's the pattern. We've seen a real shift. And that's why I say it's a flicker of hope, because instead of really joining armed groups, pursuing also in the process also being marginalized even within those groups, they are truly trying to build citizens' movements. Many governments don't recognize that. They even see that as a threat. But in actual fact, if you've looked across the continent, from Senegal to Zimbabwe to Nigeria to Sudan, which I used as a big example in my talk earlier on, you've seen how the perseverance by citizens' movements ultimately actually breaks those leaders' resolve. And it's not easy to do. And that's why protecting that, guarding that jealously, has to be one of the real areas of hope on the continent. Because if you don't, it's, power doesn't give in easily. Even though you see mass movements having fought for those freedoms, you still find a lot of resistance at the end of the day. Counter-revolutions would occur. We've seen the examples of Tunisia where you saw citizens groups having to fight back each time, to push back each time. It's a lot of work. But I think actually there's more certainty in that at this point in time than the reliance on individual or collective African leaders to do right by their people.
Now, one of the things that a lot of leaders will say is that we are a young democracy, right? And because we're a young democracy, we will make certain mistakes, or certain things will take time to happen. Now, when we look at the leadership landscape globally, there is a huge shift to younger leaders running countries, and certainly a lot more women elected into positions of president or prime minister and so on. What are your comments around that?
Yeah, I honestly believe that, it's Albert Murphy that, first said that situations make leaders. Of course, when situations change, leaders change. Our contexts are changing. Of course, Africa, in some parts of Africa is where I still find that situations change, but leaders don't change. When you truly give people an opportunity to respond to the situations in front of them. They deploy their expert power. Many people will deploy their referent power, their likability or the charisma. That actually fizzles, away very quickly. But when you give people a chance to deploy their knowledge to solve a problem, all sorts of people emerge across the board. And when you allow diversity to just really thrive in a place, you'll find young people, you'll find of various extractions from different backgrounds. You find men and women, and you see that diversity more and more in the 21st century. In the case of our continent, though, it is true that when you're a young democracy, you will make mistakes. Even old democracies still make mistakes. See what we just seen in the US, for example. So it's not the preserve of Africa alone, but you expect to see progress, and you expect to see that your citizens have equal life chances. If there are unequal life chances repeatedly, that that opportunities privilege only one group of people over the other, that the elite only think of themselves first and not their people, those are reversals. And those reversals ultimately lead to the kind of conflicts that we have seen across the continent. External intervention in our continent is also not always fair. It is true that there might be partners who are trying to pursue, of course, whilst pursuing their interests, they're trying to support the progress of that country. That's in rare cases these days. The nature of geopolitical interests is that Africa comes off worse at the end of the day. And unless we're able to think for ourselves and do things for ourselves and do things collectively and not, at the end of the day, privilege only a smaller group of people, we may not be able to overcome these stumbling blocks easily. That's what needs to change. There's too much reversal, in this democratic experiment. It's got to change.
I'm having an Africa Day conversation with the Vice President and Vice Principal at King's College in London, Professor Funmi Olonisakin. Do stay with us. We'll be right back.